Hi all, our current world chess champion Magnus Carlsen had a fantastic Isle of Man tournament recently. Let's look at a game from his perspective actually. He was playing black against Fabiano Caruana, so a mega clash here. E4 was played by Fabiano. This was in round 8 of the Isle of Man Open 2017. So we have E5, knight f3, knight c6. Now, classic RFuy Lopez so far. Now this bishop c5, this is kind of archangelist style with this bishop more aggressively placed than at e7. c3, d6, a4, rook b8. Pretty standard stuff so far. a5, a little bit of trickery here. This is a poisoned pawn actually. If knight takes, this wasn't played, then rook takes is very good. An exchange sacrifice, because this position, for example, is a nice advantage for white. It's pretty horrible there. Horrible things happen on knight takes. And on bishop takes, again, horrible things happen like this. That bishop is a potentially loose piece there. So, poisoned pawn. The bishop just retreats. But is this pawn weak? Potentially later. It's kind of disconnected from its fellow pawns. We see h3 preventing any nuisance uses of g4 in the future, especially pinning the knight, because there is already some pressure exerted on d4. Black castles. Now here he doesn't mind bishop g5, I guess because it can be kicked, and then even g5 to win this pawn. And in fact here white sets up a little trap. If knight takes here, then there's bishop d5, so that should be avoided. And you might think, well, okay, bishop e3 is afforded by h3 because there's no knight g4, so it's fairly okay to play. And it also sets up another idea of d takes, potentially hitting this bishop, or d5 even, where if this knight's moved away from the bishop, this could be a problem. And in fact, Magnus makes sure this bishop is firmly protected by the rook. It seems a bit of an odd move to play, a bit passive, but it's the principle of keeping all your pieces protected, not having unprotected pieces. So rook e1 is played. And with this, actually, bishop g5 is now activated as a threat, because earlier, if bishop g5 here, then h6 and then g5 and then knight takes e4 might have been on the cards. But now that pawn will be protected indirectly after bishop g5, and it's at this point that h6 is played, perhaps, you know, in light of that. Now knight bd2, rook e8, and here is the first move which you might think is a bit controversial, g4. The idea of marking out f5 does seem attractive. You know, maybe a knight can maneuver like this to f5, but doesn't it create potential dark square liabilities? Pawns don't go backwards. That's a fundamental thing about chess. So any pawn moves you need to make with extreme caution. We see queen e7 for the moment, knight f1. The knight is en route, it seems. Yep. Now we have knight d8, which means that c5 is possible to put some pressure on d4, but the knight might also at some point hop in later. An opportunity arises to head for maybe even f4. For the moment, knight g3, that knight is clearly looking at f5. Now c5. And actually after queen d2, we have the move c4. There was, by the way, an alternative to queen d2, an immediate knight f5. This is interesting to consider. Roughly even positions though. So anyway, queen d2, c4, bishop c2. We have knight h7. Now b4. Magnus takes that. He doesn't want white to have this locked down scenario. By taking it, this c-file could be handy for black later, with some pressure down on that pawn later maybe. We see bishop e6, bishop c2, rook c8, so already some pressure on c3, so it's handy to take that pawn. So it's more like Sicilian defense style with this semi-open c file. Bishop d3. Now knight b7 puts some pressure on a5. So it only needs things like queen d8 for that pawn to be questioned on a5. It's kind of White's disconnected pawn away from the other pawns. We have rook going to c1. Queen d8 hitting that pawn. Now White just lets it go. Queen b2. An interesting move. Interesting decision. Magnus takes the challenge. He just takes that pawn. Knight d2. Now we have d5. So Black's getting even more aggressive in the center. And you'll note that with that knight d2, by the way, that g5 square is a bit more sensitive now. You see that it's a bit neglected. Any of these dark squares, they're a bit more of an issue with White's structure like this being committed. We have rook e1, bishop b8 pointing at dark squares. E takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop f5 hitting the rook. The rook goes to c6 here, which protects the pawn. So if White does build up on the a5 knight, the knight can retreat as well, which happens actually. The knight retreats, so that pawn is protected. Rook a d1, e takes, bishop takes. If, by the way, c takes g6, this position with the option of taking on g3, Black has a nice advantage here. Look at this isolated queen's pawn. Look at the double pawns. Nice blockade. It's nice for Black. So already these scenarios are lurking behind the scenes if White is not careful. So he has to have this, this backward pawn now on c3. Knight g5. That's another neglect as well of g5. And that now Black pounces on that g5, hitting the h3 pawn. So this is getting tricky for White. There's a lot of pressure on his king side. This piece is attacking there. This knight's attacking these squares. The bishop's pointing down the diagonals. In a way, we've got kind of complementary bishops now, looking down White's king side here. So c4, rook takes e1 check. Rook takes, and now instead of taking on c4, we have this move. Bishop e6. So this is a very interesting decision indeed. So a very complicated position, and it's tricky for White. This move is very clever actually. It's hitting d4 as well, and it's maybe trying to get into f4. If White actually played in this position Queen e3, and can you see what Magnus played, which spelt total disaster for White? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now. So can you see Black to play and win basically? So 5 seconds I'll give you to find this absolutely crushing move that was played in this position. Okay. Bishop f4, yeah, this knight is a menace. Yeah. It's the end of the game. If queen takes, knight takes h3 check, winning the queen. If the queen, say, went to c3, we just take on d2, and there's a fork there instead. Yeah, it's a bit of a disastrous finish to this game, but it shows how delicate the kingside can be once you've committed to g4. How it eroded. There was stuff going on the queen side which distracted pieces away. So the pawns, if they're not looking after the squares, it can turn into a tactical disaster, as this game shows. Instead of queen e3, by the way, if bishop takes e6, this position, you can see that the knight is nicely perched here now for getting into f4. But maybe this continuation is pretty critical, hitting g3 and c4 there. And say we have this continuation, this is nice for Black. But yeah, that move just ended the game very, very quickly here, queen e3. So for me it was a fascinating encounter, because not often do you see in Super GM games this concept being tested of g4. Very aggressive, and And there may have been some situations where knight f5 might have been justifying that. But in general, as humans, we've got to be careful when we move our pawns. It does create these vulnerabilities, and it just needs pieces to be distracted for those vulnerabilities to become disaster areas, as this game shows abrupt disaster with bishop f4 here. Okay, I hope you got something from that. And we'll be looking at other Magnus Carlsen games from the Isle of Man, so it's great that he played in it. Good stuff. I hope you enjoyed this one. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks so much.